Thank you very much. I'm Brian, that's Peter. You may have known that already. We were actually going to have a moderator here in the form of a very clever designer called Matt Jones, but he wriggled out of it by forcing his wife to have twins today. Some people would do anything to get out of a gig, you know. So we're going to talk for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open it to questions. So as part of your thinking about questions, you might think about ways of keeping them quite short. Because the curse of things like this is when somebody stands up and asks a very long question, which is actually a lecture in disguise. Okay, so I'm going to start by giving a little background to this app. The app is called Scape, and it's a version of a form called generative music. And I'm going to talk about the history of generative music. In the 1960s, it became clear that there was a new way of composing starting to come into being. And certain composers who at that time were called the California minimalists, or the tonalists, or various other phrases, Terry Riley, Steve Reich, Philip Glass, and so on, were producing music by rather different means than had previously ever been produced. So, for instance, when you think of a composer, generally you think of somebody who, in classical terms, who writes in detail a piece of music. So they tell every instrument what it should be doing at every moment in the piece. Rather like you imagine an architect makes a building. What happened in the 60s is that composers, such as those I mentioned, started to make music in different ways. For instance, to give one example, a famous piece by Terry Riley called In C is actually 52 bars of music, each bar different, written in the key of C. So each bar is just a simple melody, rhythmic melody. And there are 52 of them, and each musician begins the piece. They all begin together, but each chooses individually when to move on to the next bar. So they proceed through the bars in sequence, but they don't change at the same time. So by the middle of the piece, you might have, if there are 20 musicians, you might have 15 different bars being played on top of one another. And so, of course, it's in its nature that you can't predict how that piece will sound. It's going to be different every time. It'll be different depending on the number of musicians, what instruments they're playing, because those aren't specified in the score, but also in particular at the particular speed that they each decide to move through the piece. So this sort of indeterminate or semi-determinate type of composition was really something new. There hadn't been anything like that, except possibly in some forms of jazz. There was something a little bit like that. But another very good example from that time was a piece called It's Gonna Rain by Steve Reich, which was a very simple piece which had a huge impact on me. Reich had recorded a street preacher in New Orleans, a fire and brimstone type preacher who was shouting about the end of the world. And Reich had taken a short phrase, a short loop of tape from that, where the guy is saying, "It's gonna rain." And he'd had two identical copies of that loop. He played them on two tape machines, but one of them was a slightly different speed than the other. So what happened was the two loops gradually slipped out of sync with one another, rather like an oral version of a moire pattern. And that sounds very simple, but a lot happens. In terms of audio, a lot is going on when that happens, and your brain gets very confused and intrigued by it. And that, for me, was the essence of a new way of composing, where your job as a composer is to design a system of some kind. In this case, it was two tape recorders slightly out of sync with each other. To design a system of some kind, and then to design the inputs that go into it. And you'll see in a second that this is exactly what we've done with Scape. So anyway, after being impressed by those, I started making music myself in similar ways. And in fact, all my early ambient records could be described as early examples of generative music. I came up with the name ambient in 1978, and I came up with the name generative in 1992, I think, or 90, something like that. But actually it could have been the other way around, since all my ambient music was also generatively created. By generative, I guess what I mean is music that is self-making and that makes itself probably differently in each performance. So the early generative stroke ambient pieces that I made, music for airports, discrete music, on land, Thursday afternoon, they were all pleasant records for me, but unsatisfactory in one sense, in that what I really wanted to draw attention to was not a particular piece of the output of one of these generative systems, but the system itself. What I really wanted to do was not sell a recording of one of my systems working for a few minutes, but to sell the system itself. Of course, that was impossible at that time. For example, music for airports was made using lots of tape loops threading round aluminium chairs in a large studio in Germany, with several machines running together and me recording the result of all of them. Clearly you couldn't sell that idea to an individual at home. So what I did was recorded 25 minutes of it and put that on a record. This is fine, but it was unsatisfactory to me, because the part of the theory of the music is that it should be eternal and different every time. So by about the early 1990s, I started to think that the only way I could make such a music was using computers. But I never liked computers very much as a music making device. You know, I never really imagined a future where people would be sitting at a desk staring at a screen listening to music. However, computers were about to take a turn for the better. Now, I'm going to hand over to Peter now, because it was, of course, to do with computers that our two trajectories combined. So he has a different background, but we sort of arrived at the same point together. So I'll hand over to you now.
Well, I came into generative music through a different route. I used to be a computer games programmer. And back in the late 90s, I was working on a series of games called Creatures, which involved you breeding a little creature or group of them and just having it run around this fairly huge sort of fantasy landscape. And that required a certain type of music, because people would often linger in one place for very long periods of time or move around in small amounts. There wasn't, unlike, say, some games, there was very little in the way of definite start and end points to when something would happen. So we needed music that could just sort of continue to sort of waft out very quietly in the background. And with the first iteration of Creatures, it really was that. It would play one sound, wait about 20 seconds, play another sound, and this would just carry on. We had a sort of collection of about sort of 20 sounds, I think, in total. By the time we moved to some of the later ones, I was interested in trying to extend these ideas further. And this coincided very nicely with Brian having released a book called A Year with Swollen Appendices. And one of these appendices was a history of generative music and where he was going with it. And it contained a breakdown of a piece by Cornelius Cardew. I knew that would trip me up. By Cornelius Cardew. And this piece involved a set of rules for each of the performers, which would often be along the lines of sort of sing one note and hold it for as long as your breath can go, or wait a while, sing more. I don't know if you can remember any more of the examples.
Well, the rules were very simple, actually. The main rule was when you choose your next note, choose it from any that you can hear around you. So it was constantly feeding on itself, this piece. But the interesting thing about it was that it was written for any group of people, singers or not singers, and for any number of them. But somehow what fascinated me about it was that the piece, in any performance that I ever heard of it, and I heard many, always kind of sounded like that same piece of music. And I thought, how could something that was so loosely specified actually have an identity? So that was the fascination of it. This is what that essay was about, how that identity was maintained, actually.
And one of the things that fascinated me about the piece was it's the way sort of rules seem to come out of nowhere from this. Even though they're very simple sort of rules, very complex results would appear. And I was looking for ways to try and realize that in computerized music. So I started thinking of things in terms of actually having players and having them respond to what was going on around them. So I just have a very simple collection of instruments. They'd play, they might monitor what was going on in the world around them. They'd sort of slow down, speed up, and generally adapt, and occasionally sort of shift into other pieces. And sort of bringing things a lot further forward, that's what we've looked to do with Scape. We've tried to sort of take those ideas and put them into a context of its own, where purely this is just some software that generates music that sits in an app in itself. It's just sort of a piece of music you can listen to without it having to actually accompany anything else. Maybe this would be
well, so the first thing we did together actually was not an app. We started working together on a game called Spore, which was a Will Wright game, came out 7 years ago, was it? Something like that. And in fact, a lot of the ideas that we subsequently used both in Scape and in our first two apps, Bloom and Trope, really were generated in trying to work on that, because we had the same problem with Spore as Peter was describing with the games that he'd been working on, that it was a sort of non-game-ish type of game, in the sense that the fun of it was making things, and you might want to spend quite a long time making something. So you need to be able to have a music that didn't get irritating by constantly just being a loop, the same thing going over and over. So that was when we started thinking of different ways in which music could start to develop, to evolve itself, as it were. And the first one we did, which some of you may know, was called Bloom. It was quite a big success. It's, compared to Scape, quite a simple piece, but it's still quite an elegant solution, I think. Should we play Bloom?
Time?
Yeah.
Could we have the iPad, please? Okay. So I'll just demonstrate a little bit of Bloom here. This was based around a very simple idea, and in fact, we actually had a working demonstration of this before the iPhone even existed, which we had done rather ironically using Flash. It was pretty much what you'll see here. It had just circles slowly expanding on the screen, but because at that point it was just running on a computer, it really wasn't a very satisfying place to listen to or interact with music. And then, wonderfully, the iPhone came along, and we sort of had a way of actually putting this type of music on a device that everyone would carry around with them. People would have headphones. So it was ideal. I'm just going to play a tiny bit. So perhaps I should explain a little bit about what it's doing. Every note you play comes back again, which perhaps is fairly obvious. But it's not actually being very consistent. And this is something that I think threw quite a few musicians at first who tried it, who want to try and control it and make it do their bidding. And it really won't. It's designed not to. It's very, very loose about how it echoes back what you're playing. It'll sometimes leave things waiting a bit longer. Sometimes notes will come back very fast. And we actually put this together with just a very, very small number of sounds. When I put this tech demo together, I was just looking for sounds, and these were the first ones that just leapt off the shelf at me. They seemed obvious. And oddly, since looking at it again, we never bettered them. When we tried to update it, we found actually it was very hard to sort of move away from those original sounds without it becoming something that was no longer Bloom.
So I think we really thought of Bloom as one piece of music. So it's one piece of music that now exists in millions of iterations. You know, everybody who plays that piece of music, plays a slightly different version of it, but its kind of stylistic scope is very small. It exists in a certain particular space, which is the Bloom space of music. It doesn't do everything. You're never going to get, One Direction's new album out of it or something like that. But it makes this piece of music a slightly different version for everyone who uses it. And one of the choices that we've made consistently, and I think this is because we're both quite sophisticated users of technology, is that we've very much limited the options on the apps that we've made. In fact, on everything we've done, we spend as much time deciding which things to leave out as which things to include. One of the biggest problems with most electronic instruments is that they are so diverse and so capable of so many different things that it's very difficult to ever have a relationship with them. The thing that makes an instrument good, an acoustic instrument, is that you pretty quickly know its limitations, so you can start to have a rapport with it. You know what it will do, you know what it can't do, and so you can start to have a relationship with it. The problem with being faced with infinite options, which is increasingly the case with many synthesizers, for example, and forms of software, is that you never get that kind of rapport. So the thing never really has an identity for you, and therefore you don't use it very well. So with Bloom, we had various other. In fact, we even instantiated various ideas of using different sounds and different this and different that. We, in the end, left nearly all of them out, and ended up with this very simple but rather clearly focused thing, I think. Now, by the time we came to do Scape, we were wanting to do something somewhat more ambitious, but nonetheless still not something that would make One Direction's next album. We had decided to rule that out fairly early on in the design process, but we wanted to make something that could make, well, actually the initial idea, I have to say, was that I wanted something that could write film soundtracks for me. I often get asked to do film soundtracks and I just don't have the time. But the money is very good, so so I thought, is there a way I could kind of automate this? And it was, in a way, the thought process. And so we began really by deconstructing some pieces of music that I already had in multi-track form, if you like, all their separate sounds separated, and seeing what would happen if we took those apart and built a system where they could reconfigure in semi-random or indeterminate ways. And that's really how Scape started. So maybe you should go to Scape.
Well, perhaps it'd be good if I built a Scape while we are here. So it's going to start with a blank screen. When you've been playing Scape a while, it will start to actually bring up little suggestions whenever you clear the screen, just to sort of spark a bit of creativity. Sometimes when you've been using one piece of software for a while, you fall into habits. And actually, a lot of the time on this, I was fighting against creating habits. I don't know if you've used Scape much at this point, but you may find that every time you run it, all of the elements have changed order completely. And I found I had to do that because I just kept falling into the same patterns. But let me start by building something up. So I'm going to just open some of the palettes on the side, and I'll add a background. Now,
well, let's just just explain what we have here are several palettes that you can draw from, and some of them present you with background sounds, which is to say fairly continuous backdrops. Some of them are very much foreground sounds that happen quite rarely. There are others that we call sky sounds, which seem as if they're things moving above the rest. There are some earthy sounds which seem to be below. So each of these palettes is really a different category of sounds, and within each palette there are lots of examples of that category. Sorry, so
that's quite all right.
then you can explain the other side when we get to it.
Okay. So, well, I'll add a backdrop first of all. So The background sounds just play continuously. They're typically sort of drone sounds. These ones right at the bottom here are sort of more sort of earthier drones. Then there's a palette at the top, which we sort of call air sounds. And I'll bring in one of these. They tend to be quite high and breathy. And they'll more or less play continuously, but each of those isn't typically just an individual note. Often there'll be a collection of notes. It will kind of look around and think sort of, well, what chords are already playing? Okay, room for a few extra notes up here. Sometimes it'll stick to lower notes. Occasionally it'll just stop altogether after about sort of 3 minutes ago, so it'll just give you a break for a bit and there'll be no drones at all, and that's actually quite a sort of nice effect in itself. We found these typically can be a constant presence, whereas some of these other ones, I'll go for these yellow sort of impact sounds up here, and they tend to be slightly more melodic, slightly more percussive. And they will just sort of play continuously, but rather they'll monitor the situation continuously. One might play, then wait 10 seconds, then play another few notes. Another might very carefully wait until it hears a bell sound and then stop completely.
So the other thing we should explain at this point is that each of these elements has a structure of rules underneath it. And we call it the probability matrix. Sounds good, doesn't it? We don't really call it that, but we do when we're in company. But essentially, it's a set of rules that governs how it behaves in relation to the other elements that it sees around it, for example. So one of them might only strike if it hears two other things striking at the same time. Another one will only strike when nothing else is happening. Another one will only hit on in the evenings, for instance. Another one will... There are all sorts of separate rules which are not declared anywhere. You may find out what they are by experience, or you might not.
Yeah, I should add, there's no pressure to actually try and understand all the rules. In fact, even having written them, I can't remember what most of them are, and you actually don't need to. It's the important thing is it tends to sort of give them a bit of a character, and it provides enough chaos that the music will keep shifting all the time. It could easily just sort of repeat the same few notes over and over again. While that might sound nice, it's going to sound a lot more interesting if it's got sort of a little bit of an edge, something to just sort of keep unsettling things.
Should we turn it up just a little? What do you think? If we turn it up a bit, will you still be able to hear us talk?
Okay. So
most of the music has this kind of character, which is not an accident. That's the kind of music we make anyway. There's never going to sort of appear a verse and chorus structure, for example. So it is this type of music, but actually this is capable of a very, very broad range of this type of music.
And one other thing that, particularly if you've been playing with Scape, you might notice is I've got a lot more buttons on the screen that you see when you initially start with the app. And we've actually borrowed something from the gaming world there that when I was testing it, I found if you have every single sound available to you at the start, it becomes instantly quite overwhelming. There's just too many options. You don't really spend enough time getting to know things. So we actually borrowed the idea of kind of levels, really, essentially, from games. So it will start... initially, you'll have just 5 palettes, a few sounds, and then it'll keep adding more and more. I think it may actually take about potentially up to a month to actually get the entire lot. It depends how much you use it. There's no achievement in the sense of a game. There's no sort of challenges you have to solve. It's just a case of using it, and when it thinks you've used it enough, it'll give you some more. But the feedback we've had from people who've been playing it so far has been that people have liked this. It's actually kind of made them engage with the app in a way they otherwise wouldn't have. I think
perhaps we've got to go to questions shortly, but why don't you explain this very important side here?
Okay.
Turn it down just a little bit, actually, because I'm starting to get more interested in the music than what I'm saying.
I promise I won't say anything interesting.
You never do.
It's a good time to tell me. So over on the right here, we've got a collection of moods, and what they do, as well as changing the background color, they actually are changing a whole set of filters, essentially, which process the sounds themselves. So this one at the top is actually quite a severe sort of delay. Some of the other ones will filter off a lot of the high frequency. Some are actually kind of wandering all over the place. Some of these ones, I think particularly this blue one, is actually quite chaotic and distorted. It may not be that obvious at this point, but...
Yes, because actually one thing we didn't say is that apart from the music elements that we have, there's also sets of processings in here, so that an element might sound different from in this context than it does in that context, for example. Because the actual processing, which is to say the types of reverb, the tremolos, the shudderiness, the fuzziness, the harmonic spectrum of the element is being changed as well. So these mood buttons actually are quite powerful and quite subtle in what they do as well. We had something similar in Bloom actually. We had a way of changing modes, MODE. So this is more powerful than that. This is changing mood, which sometimes includes changing mode as well. Now, if you're not confused by that, should we say anything else? I'm just thinking, no, maybe we'll go to questions, shall we? So, I will welcome your questions. If you could keep them short, that would be very much appreciated, because I'm going to repeat them afterwards anyway, for the sake of the camera. And the second thing I would ask you is if you could please ask questions the answer to which at least one other person in the room would be interested in, if you don't mind. I'm doing that to filter out the type of questions I sometimes get, which are incredibly detailed. Yeah, there's somebody there who needs a mic.
Hello, Brian. So you're probably best known for your work with pop music. Maybe? Would you agree? I was going to ask, how has your interest in generative music informed the way that you've worked with pop music and the pop form? Not all that much, to tell you the truth. They're really rather different activities. As I was saying earlier about when I used the analogy of architecture. So making music in traditional ways is a little bit like being an architect, and making a record, a pop record, is a little bit like that. You know, where you're worrying about each moment in the process and whether that should be a little bit louder and so on and so on. So you're working a lot of the time in detail. And what we're doing here is different from architecture. It's more like gardening, is always my analogy. So what we're really doing is making something that is like a box of seeds. And each time you use one of these things, it's like planting the seed and seeing how it grows on that particular occasion, and not trying to stop it being what it becomes, letting it be that particular thing this particular time. So there isn't, to be honest, much crossover, though I could bluff and pretend there was, but there isn't.
I think there's actually potential for something like that to happen. At present, one of the reasons I think I've been drawn to ambient music is it's a particularly good fit for generative music. But in principle, actually, you could have very complex chord structures. The difficulty is vocalists, that they don't tend to like being wired into computers very much. But the backing could work.
Yeah. Another one over here, please.
I was wondering if you'd ever consider selling your system empty so that users can put their own sound libraries in.
That seems like a good idea, but in fact, it's not as easy as you'd think to find the right sounds. So the craft of composing in a case like this becomes, as I said earlier, two things: designing the system, but also designing the inputs to it. And that turns out to be quite a lot harder than it seems. I mean, I'm not particularly averse to somebody else having the system. Are you? What do you think?
No, I think
you designed it, mate. Up to you.
It'd be interesting to see what someone else could do with it. But in terms of writing software that was that open-ended, I think it feels less appealing to me. What's been very enjoyable about doing Bloom, Trope, and Scape, and Air, for that matter, is it's having very, very small teams and being able to move fast and respond sort of fairly quickly, if you can call the 2 years of development quickly.
We are the team,
yes.
actually.
As soon as you've got something that's got to cater for every situation, then there's a lot more complexity to actually developing the software in the first place, although we don't have the stress of designing the sounds. And I think also you lose one of the things that's been so nice about doing Bloom and Scape, which is that it actually is very open. You need no musical skill whatsoever. With Bloom in particular, we've seen videos of sort of 6-month-old babies using it. With Scape, actually, I am getting reports of young children using it as well. And that, in neither case, that's not what we intended with it, actually. It's just been a very nice side effect. I think in Bloom, it's particularly bizarre that we sort of tried to write a sort of abstract piece of art and came up with a great child amuser.
It happens to me all the time. There's two hands at the back there. It's a stereo question.
Yes, I was saying that I've read things that you've written about how music could get out of this materialization phase that it is in. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we could imagine even pop music having elements of generative music in it. I was wondering how you feel about the intensity of the experience that you get out of a 5-minute thing as of, you compared with a generative piece of music.
You're talking about a pop record as opposed to a long piece like this, do you mean? So he's asking about duration of experience. Well, I don't know. I don't know about you, but I think of them as different types of experience. When I put one of these kinds of pieces on, I'm really listening as a different kind of listener. It's a little bit like the difference between reading a short story and a novel. If you read a novel, you sort of settle down for the long run, and you want to get very interested in the characters, and you want to know a lot about them. And you know that it's an experience that you're going to go away from and return to over a period of time. Whereas you're not likely to do that with a 3.5-minute pop song. Pop off and come back to catch the chorus. Though I used to do this thing when I was doing my installations a lot. I used to be able to go to sleep during the day, and I could fall asleep at the beginning of a verse and wake up before the end of the verse. And that's how I used to do cat naps. And I found it amazing that you could sleep for 7 or 8 seconds and feel quite refreshed. Yeah, sorry, that was completely irrelevant.
Well, and one reason I think sort of ambient music and ambient generative music sort of particularly, you can listen to it for very long periods of time, I think, is it often takes on the character more of a sort of perfume hanging in the air rather than necessarily a concrete sort of narrative or piece of music. I've found certainly testing Scape and the other apps that I've been able to keep them on for very long periods of time. And there's a phrase of Brian's that I keep coming back to, that the music should be as ignorable as it is interesting. And I think that really works, this type of music, and it's a very important characteristic of it.
Yes, and I would say the other thing is how you think about music in functional terms. Now, all of us use music, actually. You have to compare the situation we're in now with the situation 140 years ago, say, where any individual listener would be very, very lucky if they ever heard the same piece twice. So, if you were very interested in music, you might hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony 4 or 6 times in your life. Well, now we can hear pieces thousands of times. So, and not only that, we have the experience of music nearly all the time around us. We're always listening to music. Can you imagine what it was like in the early 20th century when German marching bands would go and visit a little rural village in Somerset, and their visit would be talked about for weeks in advance, and they would set up and play for an hour, and everyone was very excited, and then they'd go away for another 6 months. Can you imagine what it was like to have such a rare experience of music in your life? And now we have this almost continuous experience of music. So in a way, I think one of the things that ambient music is responding to is the idea of, well, if we're going to have continuous music, let's at least think about that. Let's at least think about what you need in a piece of music if it's going to have a duration of 1 or 2 or 6 hours. And that was kind of the starting point of thinking about ambient music for me, of what's the difference between listening to something for a short time, a one-off,
that is like a compact experience, and for a long time. And I think one of the sort of successes of ambient music has been with writers and artists. A lot of writers and artists I know like having this music playing when they're working, because it, in a sense, it sort of emotionally stabilizes an environment, is the way I think of it. It keeps you in a certain place emotionally, instead of having the radio on where your emotions are being changed every 4 minutes. Yeah, there's a lady here.
Hello, Brian. I really love your work. Just wanted to ask you, when composing music, in your view, where it's intelligent music, what would come first, rational thought or creative instinct?
Well, I think this is quite interesting. It's an interesting part of our working relationship as well, because we're both artists, and to some extent we're both thinking about technology as well. I mean, he's better at it than me, for sure, but but we both think about how to do interesting things with technology. So that means that we're both used to switching frame all the time. And what I find myself doing is thinking of a possibility, thinking, oh, you could do this. And often that's a technical possibility to do with the way a sound is made or something like that. I think you could do this. And then I do it, I make it. And then I think, oh, that sounds kind of nice. And then I'm sucked into it on a different level. I'm no longer thinking technically then. I'm thinking emotionally or artistically, if you like, aesthetically. So I'm quite happy to always be going back and forth between these frames. And I think our conversations really are really the two of us taking one of those positions and batting back and forth between them.
I think everything in Bloom, Scape, Trope actually has all been part of that process. That sort of often it's a pattern of one or the other is suggesting an idea, and then sort of say, Brian will say, but could it do this? Then I realize, well, it can do that, but that means it can also do this as well.
Yes.
And that process tends to sort of expand enormously for a while until you have loads of things, and then you just sort of strip away most of it in the end and end up with what idea out of all of that sort of really worked. I mean, with Scape, we've probably thrown away about 3/4 of the ideas we've had. And even that was built on top of other ideas that didn't quite make it as well. I think it's almost like sort of sculpture in some ways. You're just constantly refining what you've got.
I feel quite strongly that the resistance that artists often have to being articulate is self-defeating. You know, there's a lot of artists don't like to analyze the way they make their work because they're worried that they'll burst the bubble. It's got to be a kind of magical process for them. But my own experience is that thinking about it pays off. The more you think about it, the stronger your next starting point is. You can cancel out a lot of things. You can start somewhere fresh and new like that. To not think about it at all sort of condemns you to constantly going round in the same circles, I think. You need ways to disorientate yourself, to shock yourself out of habits. Like Peter was saying earlier, that we've built that into Scape, actually. There are ways of disturbing your equilibrium so that you're not going to very quickly get into routines with it, we hope. I'll tell you what I should ask. If there are any questions since this is supposed to be for developers as well, if there are any developers who specifically want to ask developer-y questions. Okay, there's one here.
Do you take a test-driven approach to development? And if so, how far do you go with the indeterminate aspects of it?
Do we take a test-driven approach? What does that mean, actually? I don't know that.
I presume by that you mean, do we just test out the software and on sort of a wider audience first, perhaps?
Well, no, the unit testing. Do you write tests on the software to make sure it's still working as you develop it?
Now I know I should. I'm afraid this is where I cling to the artist part of the word. I like to enjoy myself when I write software too. So no, Scape is not ISO 9000 compliant, I'm afraid.
What does that mean? Does it matter? No, it doesn't matter.
Probably not in the real world.
No. We testing really is him and me playing it and saying, I don't like this bit very much. This bit's really good. Can we make more of those? Last question. Who shall it be, a developer or a non-developer?
Non-developer.
I don't know how to choose. I'll let the lady with the microphone choose.
Brian, Peter, just want to say very inspiring work. Love the Scape program. In the underground here in London, they use classical music to keep the emotional stable in some certain places. Do you think Scape could work on some of the underground systems to enjoy that ambient sounds as well?
I think we'd have to probably tailor it a little bit, because some of the results you can get with Scape are actually quite unsettling, and they might become the soundtrack to a sort of underground subterranean nightmare of some kind. You know, if you were already a little bit anxious about being 200 feet underground, and then you got the wrong Scape, it could be pretty bad, couldn't it? But I like the idea of generative music in public places. That was the whole idea of music for airports. The idea that you could have a way of generating constantly changing music, rather than having, the cleaner bringing in their favorite CD and playing it over the whole airport sound system, which is what I heard that day in 1978. And I thought, there's got to be a better way than this. There's a gentleman wearing a tie. I respect that, so we'll have him.
Hi there. With the development of generative music apps and other software, meaning that people can generate their own music easily, how do you feel this affects the skilled composers and musicians of the future in making original music?
Okay, so this is about whether generative music does affect and how it affects musicians in the future. Well, I don't think it makes their skills redundant, for example. First of all, all of the sounds in Scape were made by musicians, me and him, using the skills that musicians have, and what's happened is that the system is a way of permutating those things. So essentially, it's like you hired a group of musicians and said, "Play this," but then you chopped it all up and allowed it to recombine in ways that it hadn't ever been combined before. So I don't think it changes much the role of musicians. It does change quite a lot the role of the composer, I think, because the composer has to move away from the... he doesn't have to. I mean, composers can do whatever they like, but this form of composition suggests moving away from the paradigm of the architect, the person who designs it in full detail, to this slightly further back position where you set the thing up and let it happen. So a composer, classical composer, finishes a piece of music. What we do is start pieces of music. They finish when you use them, and that's a different paradigm. And some composers don't want to do that quite naturally. They want to have complete specification of the piece. They want to know exactly how it will sound. And indeed, sometimes I do. There are pieces I make where I work on exactly that way, where I want to take care of every detail. But I also am excited by this idea of being able to construct a machine that makes music for me, that I can be as much an audience to as you are. I'm therefore not in a particularly privileged position as a listener. I'm in the same position as any other listener, and that sort of accords with me with lots of political ideas that I find stimulating, ideas of self-organizing societies and
so on and so on. That's a whole other talk, though.
I think one thing that would be interesting is if software tools for generative music evolved to a point where you could compose a generative composition as easily as we might compose a piece of music at the moment. I mean, Scape is not that. It is not attempting to be that. And I think the actual process of trying to create Scape as a generative set of processes was a very, very long and arduous one. It'd be wonderful to think sort of, oh, it'd be great if we could have this sound that did this, this and this that responded to this. And it would just be a process of a few minutes to just describe that to something that would then make it happen. But I think we're quite away from that.
Yep. Okay, we have to finish now. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.